So this is the Hornady Lock-n-Load press. It's a progressive press, meaning that it has multiple stations and it does multiple things all at the same time. It starts at stage 1, goes to stage 2, 3, 4, 5 before it's ejected. And there's a bunch of different components that you need to take a look at and to be aware of when you're going through a progressive press. To give you an idea of what each station does, I'll go through all the dies. This is a decapping and neck sizing die for a Remington 308, or Winchester 308. In other words, this case is going to go into this die and be decapped by this decapper pin. It's going to push through the bottom of this primer pocket. It's got a little hole in there where the actual explosion happens during ignition. The primer goes off and the actual explosion goes through that little hole. Well, this decapper goes through the opposite end of that hole and pushes out the primer. That primer is then pushed through a tube in the bottom of the press, and that tube goes into a wastebasket or wherever you will throw it. And while it's decapping, when this ram reaches the very top of the press, this case is pushed completely into the die and the neck is sized. This is only a neck sizer because I have a bolt action Remington 700. If you were using an automatic, not as in fully automatic, but as an automatic cycling gun, this is like an AR-15, you're reloading 223 or 5.56, you would need to full length size because the cases will not go into battery. But in this case, I've got the neck sizer completely calibrated. In order for the neck sizer and decapper to be calibrated, it needs to be inserted into the lock-and-load or into the press. And once you reach the top of the ram movement, it will actually cam over, because when you put the die into the press, you tighten it another quarter of a turn. Once you back this off, you tighten it down another quarter turn, so that once the ram is at the top of the press, it'll cam over. It'll actually lock into place. And that's when you know you have positive neck sizing and decapping. And you'll actually hear when the expended primer is actually pushed down through that primer tube. And I've actually already deprimed these cases and sized them, but that's not here when we're there. After that stage, for 308, you actually get to the priming stage, where when you push forward, there's a primer, I don't know what you want to call it, place where the primer is actually seated. There's a small pin that the primer sits on, and this is actually the primer tube where all the primers are. And when this is pushed forward, the case is actually held down in place by this shell plate holder, and when you push forward, it presses down and seats that primer. So you want to make sure every time you pull the ram up, it cams over, and every time you push the ram down, you push it past where neutral is, because that's what actually seats the primer. And when you seat the primer, you'll actually know it. If it feels like it's a soft movement and there's a nice solid ending to that movement, you know that the primer is seated. If it's real hard when you try to seat it, you'll know that either something's wrong with the primer or there's actually no primer even in the seater. After it goes through the priming stage, you raise up on the ram and nothing will actually happen because there's no die there. Sometimes you'll have, for say a pistol case, you'll have an expander that would actually actually flare the or bell the case mouth, but we don't actually need to do that for 308 Winchester. After you lower the ram and positively seat the next primer, you raise the ram up and it gets sent through the powder measure, and a charge is put into the case, just to give you a rough idea of what that looks like. And that right there, the difference between a primed case and an unprimed case, you can obviously see that the primer has obviously been seated. After the priming stage, again, it goes through the powder measure, and for the lock-and-load press, this case is going to push the entire powder measure internals upward. It goes into the powder measure, and this cam right here, it rotates, and there's a small inlet where the powder has been pre-measured, and there's an actual micrometer right here, which will only let a certain amount of powder into that inlet. Once it cams over, that inlet turns and pours all the powder into the case, and when you lower it, it again cams in the opposite direction. The inlet is filled with more powder, and that's what sets up for the next round. Now, you always want to make sure that when you're setting up your powder measure, that each charge is going to be fairly accurate. Therefore, when you set your micrometer, you want to measure your powder to make sure that it's within your specifications, which this is the book that I'm using, the Hornady manual, just like before when I was doing the case trimming. You want to make sure that you find the bullet that you're using, which I'm using 168 grain booktail hollow point. You want to make sure that whatever powder you're using is on this chart, or you can even go online and find other loading data. You want to make sure that your charges are within the specifications inside that loading data. In this case, I'm using Varget, and I'm using 35 grains of powder. This says 34.9, which will give you a velocity of 2,200 feet per second. That's completely up to you. You always want to start 10% lower than the maximum charge, which this is 42.2 grains for, 44 grains for Varget. But I went ahead and went a little lower than the maximum, the 10% under the maximum load, because I don't want to reduce the life of these cases. So I went ahead and put a lighter charge in there. And again, when you're setting your powder measure and making sure that each charge is correct, you always want to make sure that you do 3 or 4 different confirmations that the charge is exactly where you want it. Because this, if it gets a double charge or if it undercharges, you're going to have dangerous pressures which could make your gun explode. So always, once you've dialed in, let's say you first dial it and you've had it set for another gun at like 22 grains, you want to back it out. Once you finally got 35 set, you want to do 3 or 4 different charges to make sure that it's still going to be at 35. So once I've done that, I went ahead and put 35 grains of powder in here. I have a powder checker die. Now this die is very simple. It has a little ram that sets on top of the powder inside the case. It actually goes inside the case mouth, and once it's in the case mouth, when it's full of powder, that ram will be pushed up by that powder, and this white cap on top will, go to a certain height. There's a rubber white O-ring on this other spindle, and once that rubber cap meets in line with that rubber O-ring, you know that the charge is is not going to be a double charge, or it's not going to be an undercharge. So you always, once you're on your way to loading, you're starting to go through all your progressive pressing. You always want to keep an eye on this powder measure, because if it's off, let's say it's only gone halfway, or let's say it's double the height, you know that's a bad charge. You want to make sure that you take that case out, empty out, stop all of your reloading, empty out the case that had either too much or too little, and just recharge it. Because if you have too much in there, or too little in there, you're going to have danger pressures. So I go ahead and press that up, and move this over a little bit. That's pretty much in line with where it needs to be. So I go on to the next stage, which is the final stage, which is where you seat your bullet. So once you're at this stage, you want to put your bullet in the case mouth and raise the ram so that it lines up. You want to hold that bullet in line with the die. This is the cedar die. You want to make sure that it's calibrated to the correct height, which can be a little tricky. You've got an adjuster here, and you want to make sure that the actual cedar die is in the correct position. But once you've dialed it in and confirmed it with 3 or 4 different measurements, it seats the bullet, and once it seats it, it ejects it into this little bit, and you've got your case. Your bullet is completely, your ammunition is completely put together. So after each time you load a case, you'll want to make sure that it's within your maximum case overall length, which is also given in your specification manual. And for this case, in this case, it's 2.8 inches. And then you want to go ahead and measure to make sure that it's within spec, and it looks like it's good. So I'll go ahead and show a little bit of the actual progressive press in action.